mentions the obligation to circumcise a male child on the 8th day of his life. When we say here incidentally, it's almost as incidental as could possibly be. If you were to ask 100 regular people on the street that know a little bit about Torah or Bible without knowing a lot of Talmud or Jewish law or specific laws of circumcision, you would ask them, where does the concept of circumcision come from? Why do we circumcise? And they would say, well, Abraham. Abraham is the first person, the first Jew, the first person to have a circumcision. And he's commanded from then on to circumcise any new male members of the household at 8 days old. That's why we circumcise. 8-day-old boy gets a circumcision because of Abraham. And like all good Jewish answers, yes and no. Yes, many, many details about circumcision are gleaned from the story of Abraham's circumcision and how Abraham circumcised the rest of the male members of his household and from then on at 8 days old. Yes. In fact, the entire practice of circumcision is called the covenant of Abraham. So absolutely there is a connection to Abraham. However, the no part is that any biblical command, whether circumcision or otherwise, can only come from God through Moses. The verse tells us, Moses commanded us the Torah. It is an inheritance for the congregation of Jacob. Of course, God is the source of that commandment, but the transfer of that commandment, the information we got from Moses. With the exception of the first 2 of the 10 commandments, I'm the Lord your God, and do not have any other gods before me, 611 commandments, the other 611, which, of course, not coincidentally, but very specifically, is the numerical value of the word Torah, 611. So when the verse says that the Torah was commanded to us by Moses, that means those 611 commandments. It has to come through Moses. A few weeks ago, we celebrated Purim. In the Tanakh, in the book of Esther, all 4 of the precepts of the practices of what are actually termed the commands of Purim are very clearly written. The concept of reading the Megillah, the requirement to have a meal, the requirement to send gifts to the poor, the requirement to send gifts of food, all of those are written, explicit verses. But they are not biblical commandments, they are commandments of the rabbinic level, because Moses didn't tell us that, Mordechai and Esther did. And as much as it's in the Tanakh, God's word, it's not from Moses, it's not through Moses, it's not a biblical commandment. Abraham is the first Jew, but he's before Moses. And therefore, there cannot be a biblical requirement to circumcise based on something God told Abraham. When, on the other hand, in our Torah portion, as much as it's seemingly an incidental verse, and it really is, in the context of the woman giving birth to a boy, oh, by the way, on the 8th day, have a circumcision. This actually becomes the proof text, becomes the biblical basis for the commandment to circumcise, because in fact, it is from God through Moses. In this verse, one of the things that we can glean in the 5 words, at least the Hebrew 5 words that there are in this verse, is that circumcision, of course, is required to be done on the 8th day. That said, there is a famous understanding based on a verse in the book of Leviticus, in our book. In just a few parshas from now, we'll read the parsha of Acharei. And there we read about that the commandments are the way to live, they are what we are to fulfill, and live by them. Vochai bohem. The fact that the very same verse already tells us that we are to fulfill the commandments, and then goes on to say, and live by them, is obviously redundant. If I fulfill them, obviously I'm living by them. If I'm living by them, obviously I'm fulfilling them. And so the Talmud explains that this additional clause, and to live by them, is in fact a completely separate halachic legal concept that, save for the three cardinal prohibitions of Judaism, idolatry, murder, not killing, but murder, and immorality, every single other commandment, be it a requirement or a prohibition, is to be violated if it means saving your own life. Again, there are exceptions to those rules as well, but the basic idea is every single other commandment is secondary to saving your life. And so when it comes to circumcision, if a child is born and there is a medical concern that because of jaundice or something along those lines, that he would be at risk, at medical, physical risk, if the circumcision were done on the 8th day, and with time we're going to have, a healthier, stronger child, not only are we allowed to push off the circumcision, we are required to push off the circumcision until he is all the way better. And depending on how sick or weak he was, sometimes there's an additional requirement of waiting even more days of when he's already healthy and strong, just to make sure that he's going to remain healthy and strong.